Halt! Do you believe you know the face of the American Revolution? You know the man, the general, the president, the father of his country. But for every triumphant portrait of George Washington, there is another, far more astonishing reality hidden just out of frame. A man who was his constant companion, his shadow, the only person to ride with him through every single day of the Revolution, yet whose own life was a fundamental, searing contradiction to the ideals they fought for. That man was William Lee. His story is not just a footnote, it is the untold truth of America's first hero and the price of his glory. In the late spring of 1768, the air in the stables at Mount Vernon, even in late spring, carried a complex bouquet of hay, horse sweat, manure, and the faint, sweet decay of the nearby Potomac wetlands. George Washington, a Virginia planter and former colonial military officer, a man who meticulously measured his acres and his reputation with equal rigor, stood before a small group of enslaved men recently brought from West Africa and the Caribbean, delivered by the notorious dealer John Gibson. Washington was not looking for a field hand. His needs were personal, specific, and tied directly to his escalating political ambitions. He required a proper valet, a body servant who could master the intricate etiquette of the gentry, attend to the exhausting demands of his wardrobe, and accompany him without fail across the hundreds of miles of poor colonial roads. The task was not just about service, it was about projecting an image of command and wealth that Virginia society demanded. Among the group, one man stood out. He was perhaps 22 years old, powerfully built, with an intelligent, searching gaze that Washington noted with a flicker of approval. His name was Billy. Washington's ledger, a document of chilling objectivity, records the transaction. To John Gibson, for a mulatto slave, Billy, 61 pounds, 15 shillings. This precise sum, a hefty investment for the time, bought the body and the future of William Lee. For that was his full name, William, though to Washington he was merely Billy, a familiar, almost affectionate appellative for a favorite slave. The purchase was a subtle pivot point in both men's lives. For Washington, it meant the acquisition of the perfect appendage, a man who would quickly prove to be a meticulous dresser, a superb rider, and most crucially, a discreet listener. William Lee's immediate duties included tending to Washington's clothes, keeping his razor sharp, and assisting with the elaborate powdered hair of the era. He was instantly elevated above the back-breaking labor of the plantation, a privileged but profoundly restricted position in the house. For William Lee, the purchase was an arbitrary rupture, a new kind of bondage, yet it also presented a unique, dangerous proximity to power. He was now tethered to one of the most visible men in the colonies, a man whose public pronouncements about liberty were growing louder, even as he enforced the absolute lack of it for the over 300 souls he owned. William Lee's skill as a horseman was what truly cemented his place. Washington was a tireless, passionate fox hunter. He spent days in the saddle, leaping fences and enduring harsh terrain. He demanded a body servant who could keep pace. Lee was a match, not merely following, but anticipating the general's movements. In his letters, Washington later praised Lee's activity, zeal, and fidelity, noting that he has been with me during the whole of the war. This was a testament to more than loyalty. It was a survival record. Lee's physical endurance was Washington's logistical advantage. In the years leading up to 1775, William Lee traveled the gentry circuit with Washington. He saw the burgeoning discontent up close, standing silently in parlors and taverns in Williamsburg, Philadelphia, and Annapolis, where men in velvet coats debated the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts. He heard the soaring rhetoric of self-governance and natural rights, often delivered by the same men who casually instructed their own valets, like him, to fetch a fresh pipe or a new wig. Lee was an invisible observer at the birth of the American idea, a living, breathing paradox at the heart of the Revolution. By the time George Washington was summoned to Philadelphia in 1775 to attend the Second Continental Congress, a subtle but profound change had occurred in the dynamic. William Lee was no longer just a servant. He was an institution of Washington's life, the sole keeper of the small, daily secrets that the towering general never shared with his staff or his wife. He was the man who packed the general's saddlebags, polished the general's boots, and knew the general's moods better than anyone. When Washington rode north to assume command of the Continental Army, there was no question who would ride beside him. It was Billy. Chapter 2. The Shadow of the General. Boston, 1775 to New York, 1776. The transition from Mount Vernon planter to commander-in-chief was jarring for Washington, but for William Lee it was a plunge into the cold, chaotic reality of war. When they arrived outside Boston, the Continental Army was a ragtag collection of provincial militias, barely disciplined and often starving. Washington's headquarters, first in Cambridge and then in New York, became the nexus of the revolutionary effort, and Lee was in its center. He was no longer just cleaning boots. He was an unofficial quartermaster for Washington's personal needs, a crucial gatekeeper, and a symbol. In an era defined by grand military pageantry, Washington's appearance was an act of political theater. Lee was his director of costuming. He ensured Washington's buff and blue uniform was immaculate, his sidearm polished, and his general's bearing maintained even amidst disastrous retreats. Lee's visible presence, often on a fine horse directly behind Washington, was a silent reinforcement of the general's authority. An officer noted that Washington and his servant Billy are a sight for sore eyes. For the troops, they were inseparable, the general and his shadow. The most dangerous, yet strangely intimate moments of their relationship occurred on the battlefield. Lee was a non-combatant servant, but his proximity to the commander was a guarantee of peril. He was present for every major engagement: the siege of Boston, the catastrophic defeat in New York, the retreat across New Jersey. Fact: at the Battle of Harlem Heights in September 1776, Washington was close to the front lines, exposed to enemy fire. William Lee would have been right there, likely holding the general's horse, standing his ground as musket balls whizzed past. This was a consistent, terrifying reality of Lee's service. It was during this time that William Lee's unique status began to emerge. In a wartime atmosphere where thousands of enslaved people were seizing the chaos to escape to the British for a promise of freedom, a promise Lord Dunmore had made in 1775, William Lee had the greatest opportunity for flight. He was constantly mobile, he was on horseback, and he moved through territories where the king's forces were often present. Yet he stayed. His motives are forever locked away. Was it fear of the unknown? A profound sense of duty, however twisted by his enslaved status, or was it something more pragmatic? He had a unique status. He was literate and had an allowance for small purchases. He was the only enslaved person Washington mentioned in his will. Lee's world was confined, but it was a world of access, information, and a distinct lack of the physical brutality common on the field plantation. Lee even began to receive a small allowance, $4.50 in continental currency per month, for his personal spending, a significant distinction. He developed a reputation among Washington's staff, some of whom disliked his favored position, seeing him as haughty, but others, like the Marquis de Lafayette, treated him with a certain respect due to his importance to the general. The narrative of the war, as Lee witnessed it, was a constant cycle of hope and despair. He was there at the low point, the desperate crossing of the Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, an event of freezing terror and unbelievable resolve. While Washington focused on the strategy of the attack on Trenton, Lee would have been responsible for the general's personal comfort, finding a dry blanket, a meager meal, and ensuring the readiness of the general's riding horse, Blueskin or Nelson. The Revolutionary War, the crucible of American freedom, was William Lee's everyday prison. He walked the path of liberty for others, his feet tracing the trails of independence while his own body remained collateral for a debt he did not owe.
Chapter 3. The Wounds of Freedom. Valley Forge, 1777 to 1778, and beyond. The winter at Valley Forge was the defining moment of the Revolution's endurance, a season of brutal cold, starvation, and disease. For the Continental Army, it was a test of survival. For William Lee, it was a test of his physical limits. During this time, the intimacy between Washington and Lee deepened. In the small, frozen stone house Washington occupied, Lee was the single continuous presence. He maintained the general's fire, served his few sparse meals, and handled the flow of sensitive correspondence, the countless letters pleading for provisions, money, and shoes. Lee was privy to the general's frustrations, his rare moments of doubt, and the constant grinding pressure of holding an army together by sheer force of will. He saw the man behind the myth. As the war turned north and then south, Lee continued his service, facing danger that was not always from the enemy. In 1779, during a relatively calm period, a disaster struck that would define the rest of his life. While on a surveying trip with Washington, William Lee suffered a horrific fall from his horse, shattering his kneecap. The medical care of the era was rudimentary and brutal. Lee's injury never properly healed. A later attempt to mend it, using a primitive surgical technique involving a steel spring in his knee, proved equally unsuccessful. He was permanently, severely disabled. His renowned activity was gone. Washington's reaction was a complex mix of plantar paternalism and genuine regard. Lee was no longer capable of the intense riding and constant movement required of a valet. The general, however, refused to simply replace him with a younger, able-bodied man. Instead, William Lee was sent to Philadelphia to be cared for by a Quaker physician, Dr. John Jones, a man who had treated Washington himself. This was an unprecedented expenditure on a slave's health, a debt of honor paid in currency, not in manumission. When Lee's condition did not improve, he was often attended to by Washington's aide, Colonel George Augustine Washington, and his wife, Fanny Bassett Washington, Martha Washington's niece. Fanny wrote to George Washington, noting Lee's distress and confirmed the difficulty of his mobility. The injury, ironically, sealed Lee's final permanent bond with Washington. He could no longer flee, nor was he fully capable of the hard labor on the plantation. He was now wholly dependent on the general's benevolence. When the war finally culminated at Yorktown in 1781, Lee was not riding beside Washington, but was likely in a wagon or camp, still performing the personal duties he could manage. He had survived 8 years of warfare, a constant witness to the founding of a republic built on the promise of equality that excluded him entirely. Chapter 4. The General's Gift. The Post-War Years and the Presidency, 1783 to 1797. With the war won and his resignation tendered, George Washington returned to Mount Vernon a hero, a living legend. William Lee returned with him. The post-war years were a period of intense public scrutiny for Washington, and William Lee was right in the middle of it. As Washington prepared for the Constitutional Convention, and later for his inauguration as the first President of the United States, Lee served as a powerful, silent visual aid to the public. It became a strange tradition for visitors to Mount Vernon to meet William Lee, who had become a minor celebrity simply for surviving the war by the general's side. Artists and sculptors who came to capture the general's image also turned their attention to Lee. In 1785, the artist John Trumbull produced a portrait of Washington that features a black servant, most certainly Lee, waiting with the general's horse. Later, an English traveler, Julian Ursin Niemcevich, wrote in his diary about visiting Mount Vernon and meeting Washington's Negro, noting Lee's bad knees and that he had been the companion through all the campaigns. Lee, the man in the shadow, was now a public spectacle of Washington's service and, by extension, his character. When Washington was elected president in 1789, the move to New York City, then the capital, presented a new, profound complication for the family's enslaved people. Pennsylvania and New York had laws that provided for the gradual abolition of slavery. Under the Pennsylvania 1780 Act for the gradual abolition of slavery, any enslaved person brought into the state by a non-resident could petition for freedom if they resided there for 6 consecutive months. This was a direct threat to Washington's property and a massive embarrassment to his political image. Washington, the president and architect of the Constitution, devised a meticulously calculated and legal scheme to circumvent this law. He rotated his enslaved household staff, including William Lee, but less frequently due to his injuries, between Philadelphia and Mount Vernon every 5.5 months. This legal rotation prevented the slaves from fulfilling the 6-month residency requirement, ensuring they remained Washington's property. The President of the United States, the ultimate symbol of liberty, was a direct participant in the sophisticated legal evasion of an abolitionist law. Fact: Washington was deeply concerned about public perception. He wrote to his secretary, Tobias Lear, instructing them to ensure the enslaved people were not to be heard of or to become conspicuous, fearing they might be tempted to seek their freedom and cause a disagreeable public incident. William Lee's life in the president's house was defined by this legal anxiety. His knees were worse now, often forcing him to use 2 canes. He spent more time in Philadelphia taverns and around the city's free black community, a world of potential freedom that was tantalizingly close but kept out of reach by his owner's calculating rotation. Yet, despite his physical deterioration and the proximity to freedom, Lee remained. Perhaps the general's shadow offered a level of security and provision he knew he could never attain on his own as a crippled, formerly enslaved man. His service continued, a silent testament to the central hypocrisy of the new nation's capital. Chapter 5: The Final Testament. Mount Vernon and Manumission, 1799 and after. In 1797, George Washington retired permanently to Mount Vernon. Lee, by now, suffering terribly from his knees and likely relying on a wooden brace, some accounts describe a spring mechanism, was no longer able to work. He spent his final years as a living relic, a symbol of the general's past glory, a man who was perfectly useless by Washington's own admission, but whose presence was nonetheless tolerated and provided for. George Washington died on December 14, 1900. It was in his last will and testament that William Lee's singular position was revealed to the world. Washington's will was a revolutionary document in its own right, perhaps the most profound act of his life. After the death of his wife, Martha, he ordered the emancipation of all the enslaved people he owned outright, over 120 souls. It was an acknowledgement of the moral wrong he had perpetuated his entire life. But William Lee was the only exception to the weight. To my man, William Lee, I give immediate freedom, or, if he should prefer it, on account of the accidents which have befallen him and the infirmities thereby occasioned, and proper maintenance during the remainder of his life. And I do moreover give to him during his life an annual of $30 every year and a pair of boots or shoes annually. William Lee was the only enslaved person granted immediate freedom upon Washington's death. Furthermore, he was given the extraordinary choice: freedom with a generous pension or continued maintenance as a free man, but supported on the estate with the annual $30 annuity and new shoes regardless of his choice. The general provided for his former valet as no other former master did for a slave, recognizing the man's profound physical sacrifice and faithful services during the Revolutionary War. William Lee chose to remain at Mount Vernon, a free man, living on the estate where he was once enslaved, supported by his former master's will. He lived out his days there, a figure of incredible historical weight, receiving visitors who came to hear the stories of the war from the man who had seen it all from the closest vantage point. William Lee, the faithful shadow, outlived both George and Martha Washington. He died sometime around 1828, the last of George Washington's enslaved people and the final immediate witness to the Revolution's private drama. His story is not just one of bondage, but of a man who navigated the most profound moral contradiction of a new nation and whose physical sacrifice was ultimately rewarded with the very thing he helped his master fight for: liberty. He remains buried, perhaps somewhere in the enslaved people's cemetery at Mount Vernon, a man who earned his freedom through 8 years of terror and loyalty, becoming the living embodiment of the impossible truth at the heart of the American founding.